Live on WFLA Now. With a specialized degree in climate, Chief Meteorologist and Climate Specialist Jeff Berardelli is pioneering the way we look at climate and extreme weather. Welcome to Jeff's Climate Classroom, powered by ArmorView Window and Door.
All right, I want to welcome everybody to the Climate Classroom. This is a show that I've been looking forward to because I'm very interested in climate law, and there are dozens of climate lawsuits, probably more than that, around the world right now, many in the United States, that could very well not only make it through the courts, but reshape climate policy and possibly even end up tweaking energy policy in an inadvertent way. So what I want to do is just tell you about a case that was big. Last week, there was an overseas court win for climate advocates that came through the Europe's top human rights court, which basically ruled that Switzerland was not protecting these older ladies who brought the lawsuit, not protecting their health from climate change. The court ruled in favor of these women, and this is likely to have big impacts on other cases that may come up all throughout Europe, and eventually some of that casework, I imagine, will show up somehow in U.S. courts, and we're going to ask our guest about that today. Also, there are dozens of climate lawsuits in states right now suing the fossil fuel companies because of various reasons, so we'll also let our guest talk about that. So without further ado, let me bring up the two guests on the show today. One of them, of course, you recognize, that's Val Simpson. She's our very own Val Simpson here from WFLA.
Hi, everybody.
Who is climate curious, as I like to say. And this is my former law professor in Columbia University. His name is Michael Gerrard. He's a big deal. He is the founder and faculty director of the Sabin Center for Climate Law. And as I like to tell all the people that will listen to me, he is the professor's professor. He has written many of the textbooks on climate law. And I'm always bragging about that, Michael, because I'm very impressed by that. Plus, you gave me an A in your class, so I have a reason to brag about you. Welcome
Delighted
to the show.
To be here. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So with that said, let's talk about the first case, which is in Europe's top human rights court. This was a big deal because, you correct me if I'm wrong, this is the first time that an international court has ruled in favor of climate plaintiffs who are basically saying that the country, the nation, is not protecting them from climate change. So first of all, am I right in what I said? And second of all, why is that significant?
You're right. And what happened here is the country of Switzerland had joined something called the European Convention on Human Rights. The court held that convention requires the governments that have signed on to it, which is basically all the countries in Europe, to protect against climate change. So these elderly women in Switzerland said that they were harmed by extreme heat and so forth. And the court found that the government of Switzerland was violating their rights, hadn't gone far enough in fighting climate change.
So with that said, how may that impact, why is this a big deal? How may that impact other cases?
In a lot of European countries, we've been seeing the domestic courts using these international human rights theories and ordering governments actually to act. So we have decisions from the Netherlands, from Germany, from France, from some other countries in which the courts have said that the countries are not doing enough to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But this is the first time that an international tribunal has said that. And it has become, is now the authoritative law. And I think what we'll now see is similar lawsuits in a bunch of other countries in Europe that have signed on to the treaty. And there are also similar cases pending before the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, which covers Latin America. They have a climate case. This will influence them. There's another case pending before the International Court of Justice in The Hague. It may influence that. So I think it could really have global implications. Because
the attorneys that are working those cases will cite this particular case and the decision in the case. Val has a question about consequences.
Well, I did. I wanted to understand what were they seeking? What were the plaintiffs seeking in this lawsuit? What were they to gain from it?
They wanted stronger policies by the government of Switzerland. They were not looking for money damages. They wanted an order that the government do more. They got didn't get quite that. The court basically issued a declaration that Switzerland isn't doing enough, but it didn't directly order them to do more. So I think there may now be lawsuits in the courts of Switzerland saying that based on this international tribunal decision, the government has to do more.
Right. Of course, people that are listening right now may be thinking, well, Switzerland's a tiny country. What difference is that going to make? But I don't think it really, I don't think it necessarily is isolated to Switzerland, right? Because if this does have ramifications in other European countries and spreads around the world, that's really the bigger impact of this.
Yeah, but shouldn't we have seen new policies, or shouldn't have somebody not obligated them, but perhaps force them to create policies? Shouldn't we have seen that out of this case?
Well, the decision just came down last week, but we have seen is in some other countries where similar decisions have been issued based on the country's laws that there have been stronger policies. In Germany, the Constitutional Court in Germany told the Parliament, the Bundestag, that it had to enact a stronger laws on climate change, and under the leadership of Angela Merkel, the chancellor, they did.
Right.
France has also done more. Now, nobody is doing enough, but these court decisions are leading to more action in some of the governments.
I want to talk about the U.S. And first thing I want to kind of point to is something that you mentioned is Switzerland had signed on to this human rights treaty. The United States, as I learned in your class, very rarely signs on to anything internationally. So we never obligate ourselves to anything internationally. So we are likely to not see much of an impact from that unless I guess it comes up as some type of precedent in the court in U.S. cases. But is it likely to have any impact here in the U.S.?
The U.S. courts are not very big on citing the decisions from other countries or international tribunals. So the decision will probably be mentioned in some cases that I can think of, but I don't think it'll have a big effect in the U.S. It'll probably have less of an effect in the U.S. than most other countries around the world.
Right. Okay. So I want to jump to the 32 climate lawsuits that are targeting fossil fuel companies for climate damage in the United States. And so just a little background here, and something, again, I learned from your classes, so many of these lawsuits, the defendants in these lawsuits, the oil companies, were trying to push this to federal court. But in just about every case, if not every case, they were pushed back into state court, which is not what they wanted. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, in 2012, the Supreme Court issued a decision actually written by Justice Ginsburg in a case that was brought in federal court like this. And Justice Ginsburg and the full court said that the federal common law, which is something that sort of fills in the blanks, doesn't apply to greenhouse gases because we have the Clean Air Act, which gave EPA the authority to regulate greenhouse gases. So the federal court shouldn't get involved in that. But they left open the issue of whether state courts could using state law. And so we've had, starting in 2017, and now about 32 of these cases. In all the cases, the plaintiffs, who are mostly states and cities, want to be in state court, and the defendant fossil fuel companies want to be in federal court. This has been fought up and down, but it looks like these cases for now are staying in state court, which is where the plaintiffs want to be. But none of them have gotten beyond that. None of them have gotten anywhere near a trial.
Interesting. So I guess what people are going to want to know is, what are the states? I mean, I know it's different things for each different case, but what are the states suing the fossil fuel companies for?
They're basically saying that the fossil fuel companies produce all this fossil fuel and engaged in public deception. The cases are alleging that the fossil fuel companies knew all about the negative impacts of climate change, and that climate change was largely caused by burning fossil fuels, but they put out advertising and lobbying and all kinds of other things denying all of that. So they're accusing the defendant companies of deception, and they're asking for money damages. They're asking for the money to build seawalls and do everything else that's necessary to prepare for the climate change that's coming.
And if somehow it's ruled in their favor, in the plaintiff's favor, the damages could be huge, which would somehow inadvertently shape perhaps energy policy, right? And the direction of these energy companies going forward. I know it may be a long shot to think that that'll happen anytime soon, but and I want to ask you just one more thing too, because I want to bring Val into the conversation. Val was talking about how, and I was saying to her, she said, oh, the fossil fuel companies, they knew that, the climate was going to warm. And I said, they didn't just know it was going to warm. Their projections are almost exactly spot on from the 1980s to now.
I was surprised about that they had reports and studies saying that they were predicting that this was going to happen.
Exxon had some really good scientists, and they drew some curves about what they expected the temperature to be, and they were spot on.
Yeah.
So,
It wasn't publicly announced, and there were a lot of other scientists outside who were making the same kind of projections. So it's not as if Exxon were the only people who knew that, but they did know that.
right, so they were deceiving the public because they weren't bringing this to light, and they were actually funding campaigns to throw climate science into doubt. Is that right?
That's right. That's exactly right.
But in the same way that we saw big tobacco, right, go through this back in the day, do you think that we could see now these oil companies going through the same thing?
Well, that's certainly what the plaintiffs hope happens, and the tobacco cases are the ones that are closest. There's some differences. There are just a few tobacco companies, and if somebody smoked Camel cigarettes all their lives and got cancer, you know exactly where the cancer came from.
Right.
But greenhouse gases come from millions of sources over a century, so it's harder to pin down a particular impact. And another difference is that society doesn't need tobacco, but we do run on oil.
Right.
And the oil was all not only legal, but it was a matter of policy to use that stuff. We build highways and
Right.
lots of other things depending on oil.
So this is more of an opinion question because some legal experts say that fossil fuel companies could be charged with homicide depending on the case. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that there'll come a day?
I think that's unlikely. It's a lot harder to bring a criminal case than it is a civil case, and these civil cases have been pending a long time. You need to show intent in order to bring a homicide case. Now there's criminally negligent homicide, but I think that'd be a tough case. I think it's more likely that these civil cases will proceed.
So I guess what I want to ask is, there's 32 cases. Is there one or two or three you think are most likely to get to trial and potentially succeed? And if they do succeed, I know these are a lot of questions, but what could potentially be the consequences of that?
Well, the one that's ahead of the pack, I would say, is the one brought by Honolulu. The Supreme Court of Hawaii ruled in favor of the plaintiffs. It went all the way up to the state Supreme Court, which threw out all the legal defenses, and they're getting ready for discovery and ultimately a trial. But the oil companies have asked the Supreme Court to take this case. We probably won't know for a few months whether they take it. If the Supreme Court does take it, then probably these other cases are going to be put on hold for a few months till they decide it. If the Supreme Court doesn't take it, that'll also be a strong signal. And I think we'll see a lot of these cases going forward, and some of them will go to trial. So we're really waiting to hear whether the Supreme Court takes this Honolulu case.
I mean, but the consequences of the Supreme Court taking it and then saying, no, you can't sue fossil fuel companies or something to that degree would mean that all these cases are in jeopardy, right?
Yes, the Supreme Court could come out a ruling which knocks all of this out of the box. That's a possibility.
I mean, is it a likelihood? Is there any nuance there?
Well, there are lots of different ways they can go, but we know we have a very conservative 6-3 majority in the Supreme Court, and so there's a real risk that that's how it would turn out.
But I mean, some of these are state cases, so I'm having a hard time understanding that if these are being tried in state courts and state courts are deciding these decisions, how does the U.S. Supreme Court then have jurisdiction to rule over it?
Well, the theory that the oil companies are saying is that it's an intrinsically national matter, and it really shouldn't be handled at the state level. Just a couple of months ago, in a different context, the Supreme Court knocked out the effort by Colorado to take Donald Trump off the ballot because of the 13th Amendment. And they said no one state should be setting national policy like this. No one state should be, or states individually shouldn't be saying whether somebody could be on the ballot. So one could imagine that kind of theory being used here. And, the Supreme Court is very imaginative in finding ways to throw out environmental laws. They've been doing a lot of that lately since they got their 6-3 majority.
Right.
One of the cases when we started talking about this with Jeff about a week ago, he mentioned the Juliana case, and I started doing a little digging on that. Can we talk a little bit about that case? Because I know that is the case. It struck me, it impacted me because it was young people that were behind this.
Yeah, by the time this actually gets through the court system, they may be old people.
They may be, but it's true.
So this was a case brought by 21 young people. Most of them are still young in federal court in Oregon, using what's called the public trust doctrine, the idea that the government has an obligation to protect the environment, including the climate. And the trial level court said, yeah, this may make sense. It tried to hold a trial. It went back up and down to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court. And 3 years ago, the Ninth Circuit said, no go, this isn't something that the court should be decided. But then the plaintiffs went back, and instead of demanding an order that the federal government come up with and implement a huge plan to change climate change, they were just asking for a declaration of rights. So the district court said that's okay, but now the Department of Justice is asking the Ninth Circuit to shut it down.
Wow.
So we don't know what will happen with the Ninth Circuit. So
like
they may shut down the case.
It's like a lot of back and forth to just then now shut it down. It seems like
That's
that was
right.
their intention all along, just kind of.
So I want to go one step further. I think there are a lot of people in climate and environmental circles, Michael, who will wonder why the Department of Justice under a Biden administration would fight against this. But from what I understand, it's just simply the precedent of the Department of Justice to vigorously defend the United States regardless of what the politics are in office.
Yeah, but I think in addition to that, they don't like courts telling them what to do. You know, the Biden administration is doing a lot on climate, but they don't think that the court should be the ones who dictate what's done on climate. In the same way that they have opposed various international agreements that would impose binding obligations on the U.S. They don't like international bodies telling them what to do.
I'm going to veer off for a second, Val, because we were talking about this the other day. I want to veer off to, there's essentially a lot of minerals being mined on the Pacific Ocean floor. And Michael, I know you know at least something about this. And I was explaining to Val that once again, the United States refuses to sign an international treaty. And so now we're kind of not to say that we'll be blocked out from essentially mining this subsurface in the ocean, these minerals, because we'll do it on our own. But once again, it's a case of the United States not being willing to play nice with the international community. Am I right?
Yeah, it's been quite a few years since the U.S. really found itself in the business of signing international treaties. There have been a few exceptions, but for the most part, we didn't sign on to the Law of the Sea Treaty, the Treaty on the Rights of the Child, treaties on the rights of the disabled, even though that was based on U.S. law. The U.S. is not
doesn't like to play in the sandbox.
Yeah, and this, the Supreme Court says a 2/3 vote of the Senate is required to ratify a treaty. And these days, it's very hard to get 67 senators to vote for anything.
51 senators to vote for anything.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I only brought up the mineral mining because it seems like it's going to be a big deal going forward. China has so many of these plots underneath the ocean surface, and I realize that we can essentially just start mining on our own. We don't need to be a part of the international community, but it is at least frustrating to see the United States kind of dropping the ball on that and not giving assurance to U.S. companies that we are legally in the game there.
That's right. There's a lot of international dispute about the environmental impacts of deep sea mining. Is it better or worse than mining on land? We know that a lot of mining on land happens in places with horrific human rights conditions. With the energy conversion, we need a lot more minerals, and so that's going to be a growing issue.
Val, do you have any more questions? We can move on to some other cases, but I wanted to see what you were thinking.
No, that's good. If you want to go ahead and move on, I just wanted to, when we did talk about the mining situation, and you said how the United States didn't want to sign a treaty. At the end of the day, we're going to end up, because they don't want to be told what to do, right? But then we're going to be dependent on China when it comes to, because part of the reason why they're mining for those minerals are for that chip that they need for electronics, for instance, cell phones, or in this case, EV cars that have the computer systems. So in a way, it's almost like we're going to be at the mercy of what China dictates when it comes to these chips, for instance. But it's funny how they don't want to sign the treaty, but then they're willing to be under their thumb or their say, I guess. I just had a comment on that, but we can go ahead and move on.
No, I think it's a good, no, but that all makes a lot of sense. And it remains to be seen. China already owns so much of this at the moment.
Yeah.
It'd be nice if we can kind of make some headway there, but I think we got slightly off of the beaten path. Sorry about that. That was my fault, but just the idea of us not signing international treaties was something that kind of brought that up in my mind. But okay, so with that said, there were a bunch of other cases that you sent us, Michael.
The Held versus Montana.
What do you think is the most important to talk about?
So Val just mentioned Held versus Montana. This was another suit brought by young people. They brought it against the state of Montana. And this one was brought under there's a provision in the Montana state constitution creating a right to a clean environment in Montana. And this was actually one of the very few cases on climate change that has actually gone to trial. And you had climate scientists testifying under oath. The court found that for the plaintiffs, the court found that a Montana law that's basically said the state could not consider climate change when making energy policy, that state law violated the state constitution, and they threw it out. The state is now appealing that to the state Supreme Court. We'll see what happens with that. But partly inspired by that, we're seeing efforts in several other states to put environmental provisions in their constitutions. Now, Hawaii has one, and there may be a case soon going to trial in June on the Hawaii Constitution. Pennsylvania has an environmental right in their constitution that's been used against fracking. New York State just 2 years ago adopted a state constitutional amendment. So I think we're going to see, and there's an effort now to have one in California and some other states. So I think we'll see a lot more activity in the states that want to do more on the environment, and those could really have an impact within those states.
Yeah. My question on that is, shouldn't government have the obligation to address climate change for the health of the humans living in it?
One would think.
Right? I mean, isn't that common sense?
But it looks like you need something in the Constitution to say that, unless there's a statute that says that. Very few states, if any, are really doing enough to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to fight climate change, but obviously some are doing a lot more than others.
You know, it's funny that I hear Val asking these questions where it's really frustrating, right? When I first walked into Michael's classroom, I remember thinking, wait a second, you know, this is incredibly frustrating and seemingly unfair. And I think that's the first thought of a layman when they walk into, you know, a courtroom or they learn about law. But it turns out that, you know, sometimes there are gray areas. Sometimes it's not specifically written out in laws. One of those things is the EPA's ability to regulate greenhouse gases, right? Obama said that Obama went forward and put a price on carbon. But is that even set in stone now? The EPA's ability to regulate greenhouse gases? Is it possible the Supreme Court could nullify that?
I think that one is pretty safe. What is in danger, and they've always struck down, is how much they can do about it. There was a big Supreme Court decision in 2007, Massachusetts versus EPA, saying EPA can regulate greenhouse gases. But then when EPA tried to regulate coal-fired power plants, which were the biggest source of greenhouse gases, Supreme Court said they had gone too far. And the Supreme Court announced this thing called the Major Questions Doctrine, which basically said even if the statute, the words of the statute are far enough, it's not explicit enough. That Congress has to be very, very explicit. And here, since Congress hasn't explicitly told EPA to do this, they can't do it.
Yeah, so going back to the Clean Air Act, Val, Congress gave the EPA authority to regulate pollution, but it wasn't clear at the time that carbon dioxide was a pollutant. So when Obama got into office, he said, okay, carbon dioxide is a pollutant. Am I right?
Yes. Yes.
Right.
That Bush, George W. Bush had said it's not, and he was sued, and the Supreme Court said, yes, it is. And so EPA under Obama went ahead and used that authority. But the Supreme Court said in some ways they'd gone too far.
Right, because it wasn't explicit in the Clean Air Act. Right. So that Congress would have to go back and actually pass explicit legislation that says that carbon dioxide and methane, nitrous oxide, they are pollutants, and EPA has the authority to then regulate them. Otherwise, it ends up in a gray area and we end up in court, right?
So Congress in the Inflation Reduction Act actually did explicitly now say that carbon dioxide is a pollutant, but what they didn't go so far as that then say that EPA can issue regulations that have the effect of shutting down a lot of coal plants.
Right, because essentially that would not have passed. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Okay, so in order to get the barely got it over the goal line, that
Senator Manchin would not have gone along with that.
Right. So, Val, any other questions for Michael?
No, I would just, to me, it's kind of like I'm learning so much about this. And then it's just frustrating that, even oil companies, fossil fuel companies have scientists. They predicted that they have reports. Scientists are saying carbon dioxide is a pollutant. Like, we need to do something about it. And we have all this information in our hands. And it's kind of like we're not doing anything about it. So I'm like, we have all this knowledge and we could be so proactive. And it's just, like you said, it's frustrating. So that's how I feel.
And unfortunately, that's the case all around the world, that there's no country that is doing enough. There's some countries that are doing more than the U.S., but no country is doing enough. And it's getting hotter and hotter. And as Jeff repeatedly says, the weather is getting worse and worse and will probably continue to.
Something that I think about all the time, and I talk to Jeff about it, is that even though I feel like the United States, it's so much more advanced than a lot of other countries when it comes to this, with what we're trying to do at least. And I say to him, will it be enough if the United States is the only one that gets behind it? How do we get all these other South American countries, Latin America?
But as Michael taught me in his class, the United States is a leader. And when we take big action, other countries follow. And economically, if we take big action, other countries have to follow because they don't want to get left behind.
And if we don't take action, we drag everybody else down.
Yeah.
If the U.S., which is historically the largest emitter of greenhouse gases and the richest, if we're not doing everything we can, why should India or Indonesia or some other poor country that has a lot of emissions but also has hundreds of millions of people living in poverty, why should they make sacrifices if we, the rich country, are not?
So listen, we don't have much time left. I just want to ask you for last thoughts. I mean, you've been doing this such a long time that everything for you is matter of fact. And I'm just wondering if there's people that are really invested in the climate movement that are watching this right now who, really want to see countries, governments take action. Is there any hope? Is there a major hope in the courts? What would you say is the most hopeful aspect, to look forward to possibly allow courts to start, pushing for more climate policy or even energy policy?
So I think ultimately, the most important decisions are not going to be made in the courts. They're going to be made in the White House and Congress. And the outcome of this November's election will be enormously important. If it goes one way, we have a lot of action on climate change. If it goes the other way, we don't. And that's what matters more than anything else for the future of the climate.
So you're basically saying that we shouldn't rely on the courts to dictate the future course of action on climate change.
Exactly right. The courts can be very helpful or they can be harmful. But the most important decisions are not going to come from the courts. The courts are certainly not going to be our savior.
Okay. Well, that's good to know. Val, anything else before we close this?
No, this episode went by so fast. It does. Right? Didn't it? I mean, we learned so much. Thank you so much, Mr. Gerrard.
You frustrated pleasure. Val, and now I'm not going to hear the end of how frustrated she is that, it's okay. You frustrated me when I was in your class too. Because the reality is that there are no perfect, answers. There's no silver bullets to this.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, there's not.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I want to thank both of you. Michael Gerrard, thank you so much for giving me an A in your class, but more so for joining us today to school everyone on the latest on these climate lawsuits. And Val, thank you very much. I want to thank everybody at home for watching. Again, you can watch it where you watch it right now, which is on YouTube, is on Facebook, is on our website as well. But we'll also take this episode and put it on YouTube. It'll be on Spotify and also Apple Podcasts. And if you want to read a little bit more, you can go to WFLA.com, go to the weather tab, click Climate Classroom, and this will be the first story on the Climate Classroom. Again, thanks, guys, very much for joining me, and thank you at home. I will see you again next week for Climate Classroom.
Thank you.
Watch or listen to Jeff's Climate Classroom, powered by Armor View Window and Door on WFLA social media platforms, and find Jeff's climate reports on WFLA.com.